July 25th, 1944. Fonte Plateau, Guam. In the thick tropical darkness, 3,200 Japanese soldiers moved silently, like ghosts, through the jungle, taking positions around the exhausted Marines of the 3rd Marine Division. The Americans had been fighting for days, their ammunition running low, their nerves frayed by constant combat. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Wenzel's radio crackled with reports from his scattered positions. His men were spread across the plateau, vulnerable and exposed. Every military manual stated the same thing. When you are surrounded and outnumbered 3 to 1, you dig in and pray for reinforcements. The Japanese had done their homework. They knew exactly where the Marines slept. They knew which positions were the weakest. They knew the Americans had nowhere to run. When Lieutenant General Takashi gave the final signal to attack, he believed he was about to deliver a decisive blow that would crush American resistance on Guam forever. But the Japanese made one fatal assumption about what happens when you corner a United States Marine. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The first Japanese artillery shell screamed overhead at 03 Jaurs, its whistle cutting through the humid night air like a blade. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Wenzel pressed his face into the muddy ground of his command post, feeling the earth tremble beneath him as the explosion ripped through the jungle 50 yards away. The counterattack began exactly as his intelligence reports had predicted, but the sheer fury of the barrage exceeded all estimates prepared by his staff. The radio crackled in his ear as reports flooded in from across Fonte Plateau. The 3rd Battalion was under heavy mortar fire from the north. The 2nd Battalion reported muzzle flashes moving through the tree line to their east. The hospital complex near Asan Point was already under small arms fire from Japanese infiltrators who had somehow breached the outer perimeter. Wenzel grabbed his radio and began issuing orders with the calm precision that had earned him the respect of every Marine under his command. He had been through Bougainville and knew that panic in the opening minutes of an assault could unravel an entire defense faster than enemy bullets. Captain Frank Bibb's voice cut through the radio chatter from his position on the eastern slope of the plateau. His 3rd Battalion was being hit by what sounded like an entire regiment of Japanese infantry, supported by knee mortars and machine guns that had been pre-positioned during daylight hours. The enemy had spent weeks studying American defensive patterns, identifying every foxhole, every supply route, every weak point in the Marine perimeter. They were executing a textbook encirclement, designed to cut off American units from their command structure and destroy them piecemeal before dawn. But Lieutenant General Takashi had made his calculations based on European battlefield tactics, where surrounded forces typically surrendered or retreated when faced with overwhelming odds. He failed to account for a fundamental difference in how American Marines reacted to being cornered. As the Japanese assault waves crashed against the outer defensive positions, something unexpected began to happen. Instead of falling back or requesting permission to withdraw, individual Marine units began to dig in even harder and fight with increased intensity. Private First Class James O'Connor hunkered down in his foxhole on the southeastern edge of the perimeter, watching tracer rounds streak through the darkness like angry fireflies. He had been in combat for exactly 11 days since landing on Guam, and this was the first time he had seen enemy soldiers moving in organized formations, rather than the desperate, isolated attacks of the previous week. Through the sights of his rifle, he could make out Japanese infantry advancing in 3 distinct waves, each larger than the last. The sight should have terrified him, but instead he felt something entirely different, a cold, focused anger that seemed to sharpen his vision and steady his hands. The Japanese had positioned their heaviest weaponry to prioritize targeting Marine artillery positions, understanding that American defensive doctrine relied heavily on coordinated fire support. But Wenzel had anticipated this tactic and had redeployed his howitzers the previous afternoon, moving them to secondary positions that were not marked on any captured American map. As enemy mortars began to fall on empty gun positions, Marine artillery crews were already preparing their response from concealed positions 800 yards away. Sergeant Major William Hayes coordinated the counterfire with the methodical precision of a man who had been dropping artillery rounds on enemy positions since Guadalcanal. His forward observers relayed coordinates over encrypted radio channels, while Japanese infiltrators desperately searched for the source of the devastating American fire support. The 155mm howitzers began their work at Oro 345. Each round was carefully aimed at muzzle flashes and patterns of movement that betrayed enemy positions. The Japanese committed almost their entire reserve to this single assault, believing that one overwhelming night attack would crush American morale and force a general retreat to the beaches. Intelligence reports had convinced Takashi that the Marines were exhausted, poorly supplied, and psychologically broken by 2 weeks of continuous combat. What his staff failed to understand was that American units under extreme pressure did not break and run. They consolidated, adapted, and became exponentially more dangerous. At 04 Rao, the first wave of Japanese infantry reached the outer wire of the Marine defensive perimeter. They advanced through terrain that military doctrine considered impassable for organized units, utilizing jungles and ravines not marked on American tactical maps. The assault was intended to achieve complete tactical surprise, overwhelming scattered Marine positions before a coordinated defense could be organized. Instead, the Japanese found themselves in carefully prepared kill zones that had been registered and rehearsed over the previous week. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Do you feel cornered? Much like those Marines on Guam, where every attempt to break free from routine or learn something new ends in failure? Does it feel like obstacles are everywhere and your strength to fight is dwindling? Perhaps you're making the very mistake that prevents you from moving forward without even realizing it. We've often discussed the importance of not just staying afloat, but also finding the strength to break through. And today we'll explain how, even in the most desperate situations, you can not only endure, but turn it to your advantage. We've been there ourselves on the brink when it seemed there was no way out, but we managed to turn the tide, and you can too. In this video, we'll reveal 3 key principles that will allow you to not just survive, but thrive, even when circumstances are against you. And here's the first one. Imagine. You're confident you know how to act, but what if everything you've been taught actually distorts reality? What if the most obvious solutions lead to a dead end, and the truth lies in completely unexpected approaches? You're making this mistake with every step you take, but you don't notice it. How is this possible? Your brain is already protesting. Why is that? Explain yourself. This very contradiction holds the key to your transformation. Forget everything you learned in the school of life. It's a lie. In reality, there are hidden mechanisms that allow ordinary people to achieve extraordinary results, even when they are cornered. We'll show you how to rethink conventional approaches and discover what lies beyond your current understanding. And this is just the beginning. We'll constantly throw new ideas and unexpected twists your way to keep you glued to the screen. Each segment of this video will seamlessly flow into the next, creating a single captivating story. You won't even notice where one thought ends and another begins. For you, this won't be a collection of isolated tips, but a complete, engaging journey full of discoveries. Ready to learn how ordinary people turn hopeless situations into their triumph? Then stay with us and prepare for your perception of what's possible to change forever. Imagine deep night, tropical heat, an enemy outnumbering you, and their attack aimed at your most vulnerable point. Have you ever been in a situation where nothing goes to plan, when defeat seemed inevitable? But deep down you knew retreat was not an option. Many of us face such moments when all efforts seem futile and the enemy is about to break our will. We've been there too, on the edge. But it's in these critical moments that true strength is born, capable of turning the tide of any battle. You might think that the outcome of a battle is decided solely by troop numbers and armament power. But there's something far more important that your opponents always overlook. Forget everything you've learned about night combat tactics. On that fateful night on Guam, entirely different rules applied, breaking all military conventions. Today we'll tell you how, even in the face of imminent defeat, you can not only stand your ground but triumph, using 3 key principles that Japanese generals failed to decipher. And here's the first one. Stay with us and watch until the end to find out how this incredible confrontation concluded. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. That night, when Japanese forces crashed against the U.S. Marine Corps positions on Guam, their plans were meticulously crafted, but they failed to account for one thing: the ferocity and unyielding will of those who stood in their way. Machine gun crews, commanded by corporals and privates first class, opened fire with the honed precision that can only be acquired after months of grueling training, preparing for exactly this scenario. Water-cooled Browning M1917 machine guns spewed up to 600 rounds per minute, creating interlocking fields of fire impassable for any infantry formation. The Japanese certainly expected American resistance, but they were utterly unprepared for such searing ferocity. They encountered not just a defense, but a living wall of determination. Stay with us and watch until the end to fully understand this story. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription, and of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Captain Bibb, observing through binoculars, watched as the enemy's second wave desperately tried to exploit gaps that, by all calculations, should have appeared in the Marine lines after the first assault. Japanese tactics called for continuous pressure that would eventually expose weak points in any defense, allowing subsequent forces to break through and collapse the entire perimeter from within. However, these vulnerabilities did not materialize. Each position that took a heavy hit seemed only to strengthen, not weaken, as Marines from adjacent sectors moved to reinforce threatened areas without waiting for orders from higher command. This was not merely a defense, it was a living, breathing organism, instantly reacting to any threat. The technological advantages that American forces enjoyed in daytime operations, according to Japanese plans, were supposed to be completely neutralized by darkness and close quarters combat. Japanese strategists specifically chose a night assault tactic to deprive American units of the ability to use their superior artillery, air support, and armor. But the Marines had spent months adapting their equipment and tactics precisely for such conditions. Radio communication remained clear and effective. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and supporting forces continued to function with devastating effectiveness, turning every shot into a deadly chord in this symphony of war. It was this flexibility and readiness for any eventuality that became the second principle, baffling the enemy command. By 05 hour, the Japanese third wave was advancing through the scattered remnants of their first two assault formations. The attack had cost them nearly 800 casualties in less than 2 hours. But General Takashi remained convinced that American resistance was weakening. His field commanders reported that Marine positions were still holding, but in his mind, these were merely the last convulsions of a routed force that would collapse under one more concentrated push. What the Japanese general failed to understand was that he had just encountered the most dangerous phenomenon in infantry warfare: United States Marines, who had made a firm decision not to retreat. This was not mere stubbornness. It was a profound understanding of their mission, which became the third and decisive factor in this battle. Lieutenant General Takashi studied the combat reports coming in from his assault commanders and felt the first cold touch of doubt creeping into his calculations. His staff had assured him that American resistance would collapse within 3 hours of continuous assault. But the sun was already beginning to rise over Fonte Plateau, and Marine positions remained intact across the entire front. Even more alarming were the casualty figures that his regimental commanders reluctantly relayed over encrypted radio transmissions. The 29th Infantry Division had already lost nearly half its combat strength, and the planned breakthrough to the divisional hospital had completely stalled. Each new report only deepened his bewilderment, as reality drastically diverged from his carefully constructed plans. The Japanese general committed his last reserve at 05:30, sending his most experienced infantry regiment in a desperate attempt to break the Marine perimeter. Before full daylight exposed his forces to American artillery and airstrikes. These were soldiers who had been through the China campaign and survived brutal fighting on Pacific Islands over the previous 2 years. They advanced with the disciplined precision of veterans who understood that this assault would determine whether organized Japanese resistance on Guam would continue or collapse entirely. But something had fundamentally gone wrong with Japanese intelligence regarding American defensive capabilities. The Marines were not behaving like cornered and demoralized forces awaiting evacuation. Instead, they fought with the coordinated intensity of a unit determined to hold its ground at all costs, which came as another shock to the Japanese command. Radio intercepts showed that American commanders were actually requesting additional ammunition and permission to launch counterattacks against Japanese positions weakened by the failed night assault. This was not a sign of desperation, but a signal for further aggression. Sergeant Taro Matsuoka led his infiltration squad through a narrow ravine that American intelligence had apparently missed during its initial survey of the plateau. His mission was to infiltrate the hospital complex near Asan Point and eliminate the medical personnel treating wounded Marines. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized that destroying enemy medical capabilities would force American units to choose between abandoning their wounded or committing additional forces to defend the hospital, creating opportunities for exploitation elsewhere along the perimeter. It was a cunning plan designed to undermine enemy morale from within. The 20-man infiltration team had trained for this specific mission for 3 weeks, using a mock-up of the facility built behind Japanese lines. They knew the exact layout of the hospital complex, the location of each tent and supply bunker, the medical staff's shift schedules, and the defensive positions the Marines would likely establish around the perimeter. What they didn't expect was to encounter an augmented squad of Marines who had been specifically assigned to counter infiltration after intelligence reports suggested precisely this type of attack. Further proof that the Americans were one step ahead. Private First Class O'Connor had been reassigned to hospital guard duty 6 hours before the Japanese assault began, part of a defensive adjustment Lieutenant Colonel Wenzel had implemented based on intercepted enemy radio chatter. The young Marine had never been in close quarters combat against enemy infiltrators, but his training had prepared him for exactly this scenario. When Matsuoka's squad emerged from the ravine at 06 Gauss, they found themselves facing prepared positions defended by Marines who were already waiting for them. It was a perfect example of how foresight and adaptation change the outcome of a battle. The firefight that erupted around the hospital complex lasted exactly 17 minutes and demonstrated a fundamental problem that was eroding Japanese assault capabilities across Fonte Plateau. Individual American units were not merely defending fixed positions, but actively adapting their tactics based on real-time battlefield developments. Marine squads repositioned to support one another without waiting for orders from higher command, creating interlocking fields of fire that eliminated gaps and weak points that Japanese infiltration tactics were designed to exploit. It was a living, dynamic response to every threat, which ultimately led to triumph. It all started with what was planned for exploitation. Officer Bibb, commanding the unit, received reports from his forward observers. According to their intelligence, Japanese supply columns had begun retreating from the advanced positions they had managed to occupy during the night assault. Over the first 5 hours of fierce fighting, the enemy had expended a colossal amount of ammunition, and it became clear that Japanese logistical capabilities were insufficient to sustain the intensity of battle required by their offensive plan. More importantly, intercepted radio traffic revealed that Japanese commanders were progressively losing contact with many of their subordinate units as American artillery methodically destroyed enemy command posts and communication equipment. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The technological advantages developed by American forces over 2 years of Pacific campaigns proved decisive, and in ways neither side had fully anticipated. Marine artillerymen utilized advanced observation methods and radio coordination procedures, enabling them to deliver precise supporting fire within minutes of receiving target coordinates. Japanese forces, accustomed to fighting adversaries with limited artillery capabilities, found themselves under relentless bombardment from guns they could neither locate nor counter. At 0645, Wenzel authorized the deployment of M4 Sherman tanks, which had been held in reserve during the night fighting. 5 medium tanks advanced along predetermined routes, cleared of obstacles the previous week. Their 37mm cannons and coaxial machine guns engaged Japanese positions at ranges inaccessible to enemy infantry weapons. The tanks moved slowly through the jungle, but their presence dramatically altered the tactical balance of power in the battle. Japanese anti-tank capabilities on Guam primarily consisted of individual soldiers carrying magnetic mines and satchel charges, weapons that required extremely close proximity for effective use. The tanks operated in coordination with Marine infantry squads, who prevented enemy soldiers from closing to effective range, while their armor allowed them to advance into areas where unshielded infantry could not survive. Each Sherman carried enough ammunition to fire for several hours of continuous combat, providing sustained fire support that Japanese forces were unable to neutralize. The psychological impact of American armor proved as significant as its tactical effectiveness. Japanese soldiers who had endured hours of artillery barrages and machine gun fire now faced combat platforms that seemed invulnerable to their available anti-tank measures. Reports from captured Japanese soldiers later indicated that many units began to lose cohesion as Marine tank counterattacks developed across multiple sectors of the front. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. By 07 Zhao, Lieutenant General Takashina was receiving reports that his assault forces had begun retreating from forward positions without authorization from higher command. Individual Japanese units were making independent decisions to withdraw when their tactical situation became untenable. This breakdown in military discipline signaled the complete failure of the counterattack. The general had committed his entire strategic reserve to this single assault, and the collapse of coordinated resistance meant that organized Japanese defense of Guam was effectively over. The hospital complex that Sergeant Matsuoka had attempted to capture remained securely in American hands. The veteran Japanese infiltration specialist lay dead in a drainage ditch 50 yards from his objective, killed by a 19-year-old Marine who had been in combat for less than 2 weeks. Scattered equipment and the bodies of his sabotage team around him marked the farthest point of Japanese penetration into the American defensive perimeter. Captain Bibb established radio contact with his battalion commander and requested permission to pursue the retreating Japanese forces, but Wenzel ordered all Marine units to hold their defensive positions until the extent of the enemy's withdrawal was fully determined. American casualties were surprisingly light given the intensity of the night assault, but ammunition expenditure had been enormous, and resupply operations were necessary before any major offensive action could be undertaken. The sun climbed higher over Fonte Plateau, illuminating a battlefield where the strategic balance of power on Guam had decisively shifted during 6 hours of darkness. Japanese forces, who began the night with overwhelming numerical superiority, were now scattered, demoralized, and incapable of launching another coordinated attack. The Marines, who had been surrounded and outnumbered, not only survived, but had effectively destroyed the Japanese offensive capabilities, in a single engagement. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fonte Plateau as Lieutenant Colonel Wenzel surveyed the battlefield, transformed by 6 hours of desperate fighting. Japanese bodies lay scattered across the approaches to the Marine positions, forming patterns that told the tactical story of a failed assault. The enemy had committed everything to this single attack and lost not only the battle, but also their ability to organize resistance anywhere else on Guam. Wenzel's radioman delivered a message from division headquarters, authorizing an immediate advance to secure the plateau and eliminate remaining pockets of Japanese resistance. Private First Class O'Connor climbed out of his foxhole near the hospital complex and began the grim task of counting enemy casualties in his sector. 17 Japanese soldiers had died attempting to breach the medical facility, including the infiltration specialist, whose equipment and documents would provide valuable intelligence on enemy capabilities and intentions. The young Marine had fired his M1 Garand rifle 43 times during the night's battle, each shot aimed with the precision months of training had drilled into his muscle memory. He felt no satisfaction in killing, but understood that his actions had saved the lives of wounded Marines who would have died without medical attention. In the midst of the Battle of Guam, when the island's fate seemed to hang by a thread and American Marines fought a desperate defense, something happened that changed everything. Could you imagine that in just a few hours, from chaos and impending defeat, a victory would be born that would turn the entire strategic picture around? Today, we delve into those dramatic events, uncovering how the Marines managed to reverse the tide of the fiercest night battle, and why the Japanese command made a fatal mistake that cost them the island. This is a story not just of bravery, but of how, even in the most hopeless situations, a path to triumph can be found. After the Japanese forces abandoned their positions in a disorganized retreat, Captain Bibb received orders to direct his 3rd Battalion toward the strategically important high ground. This hasty enemy withdrawal was so chaotic that valuable equipment and supplies were left behind on the battlefield, including artillery pieces that could have provided a solid defense of the plateau had Japanese commanders managed to maintain control over their units. American reconnaissance teams would spend days cataloging all the abandoned material. But a far more significant discovery was the complete collapse of Japanese command and control systems, laid bare after the failed assault. This heralded a new phase in the battle. With the first rays of sun precisely at 0830, the M4 Sherman tanks, which had proven their undeniable power in the final phase of the night battle, began their ascent up the slopes of Fonte Plateau. 5 medium tanks moved in strict, coordinated order, their crews meticulously scanning the terrain for anti-tank positions and potential obstacles that could impede their advance. However, Japanese defensive preparations had been entirely focused on repelling exclusively infantry attacks. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The rapid collapse of organized resistance led to most anti-tank weaponry being either abandoned or destroyed during the swift retreat. Lieutenant General Takashina established his final command post in a cave complex on the northern edge of the plateau, surrounded by scattered remnants of units that had suffered catastrophic losses during the failed counterattack. His staff officers reported that the effective strength of combat-ready Japanese soldiers on Guam had dwindled to fewer than 1,000 men, most of whom were isolated in small groups, lacking communication and coordination with higher command. The general realized that organized resistance was no longer possible, but Japanese military doctrine required him to continue fighting to the death, refusing surrender. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Marine artillery crews began systematically destroying suspected Japanese positions across the plateau, using coordinates provided by forward observers and aerial reconnaissance data. 155mm howitzers delivered high explosive shells with devastating accuracy, eliminating cave complexes and fortified points that could have sheltered enemy forces attempting to regroup for continued resistance. Each artillery mission was carefully planned to minimize civilian casualties while ensuring the complete destruction of Japanese military potential. By noon on July 27th, forward elements of the 21st Marine Regiment had occupied positions offering a full view of the entire northern part of Guam. The tactical situation had completely reversed from the desperate defensive fighting of the previous night. American forces now controlled the commanding heights and possessed overwhelming superiority in artillery, armor, and air support. Japanese troops were reduced to small groups, hiding in caves and jungles, incapable of coordinated action, and gradually being eliminated through systematic search-and-destroy operations. Company A encountered the largest remaining pocket of Japanese resistance at 14-0, when approximately 60 enemy soldiers attempted to establish a defensive position in a ravine that offered natural protection from American artillery. The battle lasted 45 minutes and clearly demonstrated the fundamental tactical changes that had occurred after the failed night assault. Japanese soldiers fought with desperate bravery, but they lacked the weapons, ammunition, and coordination necessary to halt the advancing Marine units supported by tanks and artillery. Lieutenant General Takashina's demise occurred during this final engagement, as the Japanese commander attempted to lead a last desperate charge against American positions. Marine riflemen, with accurate fire, eliminated the general and his staff officers, effectively decapitating the Japanese leadership and ending organized resistance in that sector. The death of the senior Japanese commander symbolized the complete collapse of the enemy's defensive capabilities and marked the beginning of the final phase of securing Guam. Private First Class O'Connor participated in the advance that cleared the ravine where Takashina made his last stand. In less than 24 hours of intense combat, the young Marine had transformed from a frightened recruit into a hardened veteran. His actions during the hospital's defense earned him recognition from his squad leader and demonstrated the transformation that combat experience produces in American soldiers who survive their first major battle. The confidence and tactical knowledge he gained would prove invaluable during the remaining security operations on the island. Marine engineers began clearing routes for supply vehicles and establishing communication lines to support continuous operations against scattered Japanese resistance across Guam. The logistical capabilities possessed by American forces gave them decisive advantages in prolonged combat, while Japanese soldiers were forced to forage for food and ammunition. Marine units regularly received everything necessary to maintain combat effectiveness for weeks or even months of further fighting. by 18 Kao on July 29th, organized Japanese resistance on Fonte Plateau was completely suppressed. Marine patrols reported contact only with isolated individuals and small groups, who no longer posed a threat to American control over the strategically important heights. The battle, which began with Japanese forces surrounding and outnumbering American defensive positions, concluded with the complete destruction of the enemy's offensive capabilities and the establishment of firm U.S. control over critical terrain on Guam. Lieutenant Colonel Wells established his command post in the very cave complex that Lieutenant General Takashina had used in his final hours, symbolically occupying the position from which Japanese resistance had been coordinated. The American victory was achieved through superior tactics, technology, and training, but most importantly, through the fighting spirit of individual Marines who refused to be defeated, regardless of the challenges they faced. The 21st Marine Regiment demonstrated that American infantry units possessed capabilities that enemy commanders fundamentally underestimated. Imagine a battle where one side, seemingly doomed, deals a crushing blow, losing dozens of times fewer soldiers, where, by all laws of military art, there should have been a rout, but instead triumph. Today we will tell a story that will make you rethink everything you knew about the Battle of Guam and show you exactly how the impossible happened. For what occurred on Fonte Plateau seemed to defy every military textbook. Japanese forces lost approximately 3,200 soldiers killed, and the survivors were either wounded or scattered across the island in small groups. American losses were fewer than 200 killed and wounded, a ratio eloquently demonstrating the decisive nature of the tactical victory. This meant the complete destruction of Japan's offensive potential, leaving the remaining enemy forces on Guam with only the option of symbolic resistance to American security operations across the entire island. The company commander's report, compiled after the battle, detailed the tactical innovations that played a decisive role in the night engagement. American defensive doctrine, honed over months of Pacific campaigns, had undergone significant evolution, emphasizing flexibility, coordinated action, and aggressive responses to enemy attacks. The Marines holding Fonte Plateau embodied the pinnacle of military training and combat experience, transforming American infantry into the most formidable fighting force in the Pacific theater. The silence that fell over Fonte Plateau on the morning of July 30th carried a weight that pressed upon the consciousness of every Marine who survived that night, a night that changed everything. Stay with us and watch until the end, as we are only just beginning to uncover the details of this incredible story. We'd be especially grateful for your like and subscription, and of course, don't forget to tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Private First Class O'Connor, sitting on the edge of his foxhole, cleaned his M1 Garand rifle with the methodical precision that combat had instilled in him. His hands moved automatically, while his mind painfully tried to comprehend what he had seen and done. The hospital complex where he had killed his first enemy soldier now looked serene in the morning sunlight, yet memories of muzzle flashes and desperate voices calling for ammunition would haunt him for decades. The company commander moved among his men, checking on wounded Marines and ensuring the proper distribution of ammunition and medical supplies. In their faces, he recognized the same haggard expression he saw in his own reflection. In 6 hours of desperate struggle, they had accomplished something remarkable, but the cost of that achievement was evident in the exhaustion that ran deeper than ordinary physical fatigue. These were men who had stared into the face of their own mortality and discovered inexhaustible reserves of courage and determination they never knew they possessed. The bodies of Japanese soldiers, scattered across the plateau, told a story of tactical miscalculation and strategic failure that military historians would study for generations. Lieutenant General Takashina had committed all his forces to a single attack that, by all principles of traditional warfare, should have succeeded. The Americans were outnumbered, surrounded, and cut off from reinforcements. And yet, something fundamental in the character of Marine Corps training and leadership transformed what should have been a defeat into such a complete victory that organized Japanese resistance on Guam was finally broken. To not miss the next chapters of this thrilling story and learn about further exploits, stay with us and watch the video until the end. We would be especially grateful for your like and subscription, and of course, don't forget to tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Lieutenant Colonel Wells erected a temporary memorial near his command post, using a piece of shrapnel-riddled metal to mark the spot where 17 Marines had died, defending positions they refused to yield. The names of the fallen were engraved on the makeshift monument with a combat knife, creating a permanent record of a sacrifice that would outlast the war itself. Wells understood that his men needed time to process what they had endured, but the tactical situation demanded continued operations to secure the rest of the island before scattered Japanese forces could reorganize. Medical personnel worked tirelessly, tending to Marines wounded during the night's battle. The hospital near Orote Point, which the sergeant had died trying to capture, remained fully functional throughout the engagement. The Japanese infiltrators' mission, intended to cripple American medical capabilities, had utterly failed, ensuring immediate treatment for wounded Marines, saving dozens of lives. Navy corpsmen moved among the casualties with a quiet professionalism that made them legends among the infantrymen they served, providing care that transformed potentially fatal injuries into treatable traumas. The psychological effect of the battle extended far beyond the immediate participants, impacting the Japanese civilian population across the Pacific region, who had been indoctrinated to believe American forces were weak and demoralized. Radio broadcasts from Tokyo promised that the counterattack on Guam would demonstrate Japanese military superiority and force the United States to negotiate a favorable peace settlement. Instead, the complete destruction of Japanese offensive potential revealed the fundamental weakness of enemy strategic planning and the growing power of American military capabilities. Private First Class O'Connor received word that his actions during the hospital's defense earned him a Bronze Star with a V device, an acknowledgement that seemed surreal to a young man who had been consumed by terror for much of the battle. His squad leader explained that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act effectively despite it. This lesson would serve him well throughout the remainder of his military service. The medal symbolized not only personal heroism, but also the collective achievement of Marines who refused to be defeated against all the odds they faced. Marine intelligence teams spent several days interrogating captured Japanese soldiers and examining abandoned equipment to understand how enemy forces achieved tactical surprise despite American surveillance capabilities. The infiltration routes and attack methods employed by Japanese commanders indicated sophisticated preparation and planning that should have led to a successful assault. The failure of such a well-conceived operation demonstrated that American defensive doctrine had evolved to counter enemy tactical innovations through superior training and leadership. Imagine the night when everything went wrong, when you found yourself surrounded and every enemy step could be your last. Have you ever felt there was no way out, that the odds were stacked against you, and hope was fading with every second? This isn't just a page from a textbook. This is a story of how, in the pitch-black darkness, under relentless fire, a handful of people not only held their ground but turned the tide of an entire campaign, changing future wars. You might think the path to victory always lies in strictly following orders and pre-designed plans. But it was precisely the deviation from these, the initiative shown at the most critical moment, that became the key to a triumph that shook the entire Pacific theater of operations. Forget everything you were taught about static defense. Sometimes salvation lies in the unexpected and the audacious. In this narrative, we will examine in detail how just one desperate battle on the distant island of Guam not only reshaped U.S. Marine Corps tactics, but also forced Japanese strategists to fundamentally rethink all their defensive plans. And here is the first astonishing lesson the world learned from that night. Victory, against all odds, was achieved not because of, but in spite of, rigid regulations. The company commander, having survived that hellish ordeal, immediately submitted comprehensive recommendations for tactical changes based on the lessons learned from the night engagement. American defensive positions, it turned out, were in urgent need of improved communication between adjacent units and more effective coordination with supporting artillery and armor. The success of Japanese infiltration attempts clearly highlighted the dire need for additional counter-infiltration patrols and more advanced early warning systems. Most importantly, this battle vividly demonstrated that Marine Corps units performed best when individual initiative was encouraged rather than suppressed by rigid adherence to predetermined plans. Stay with us and watch until the end to discover all the details of this incredible story. We would be especially grateful for a like and a subscription, and of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The reconstruction of Guam began immediately after organized Japanese resistance was suppressed. Marine engineers and construction battalions, Seabees, worked tirelessly to repair the damage caused by weeks of intense combat. The airfield, which would later become a staging point for B-29 bombers attacking the Japanese mainland, was significantly expanded and improved, incorporating lessons learned from previous Pacific campaigns. Local residents who had endured the Japanese occupation received much-needed medical aid and supplies, marking the beginning of the restoration of civil administration under American authority. We will continue our deep dive into this unique story. But before we move on, we want to once again ask you to stay with us until the very end. Your support in the form of a like and a subscription is invaluable to us, and we would be delighted if you shared in the comments which corner of the world you are watching from. Lieutenant Colonel Well was promoted to full colonel and assigned to division staff, a testament to his outstanding leadership qualities, which proved decisive during the most critical phase of the Guam campaign. His tactical innovations and calm decision-making under extreme pressure prevented a potential disaster, turning a defensive battle into a decisive victory. The methods he developed were subsequently incorporated into Marine Corps doctrine and taught in military academies for decades after the war's conclusion. The strategic implications of the Battle of Fonte Plateau resonated throughout the Pacific theater, where Japanese commanders anxiously realized that American infantry capabilities far exceeded their previous assessments. The complete annihilation of numerically superior enemy forces in a single engagement demonstrated that traditional tactical approaches were ineffective against an enemy who combined advanced technology with exceptional training and leadership. Japanese defensive planning for remaining strongholds in the Pacific was fundamentally altered after a thorough analysis of the events that transpired on Guam. Private First Class O'Connor was evacuated to a hospital in Hawaii for treatment of wounds that proved more severe than initially diagnosed. Nevertheless, he returned to combat operations within 3 months and participated in the assault on Iwo Jima. The experience of surviving his first major engagement transformed him from a mere recruit into a seasoned combat veteran whose skills and knowledge proved invaluable in subsequent operations. His personal evolution mirrored the broader transformation of American military capabilities that occurred throughout the Pacific War. The final casualty count revealed the true scale of what was achieved during 6 hours of desperate fighting. Japanese forces suffered 3,200 killed, with fewer than 100 prisoners taken, and the rest scattered in small groups across the island. American losses totaled 197 killed and wounded, a ratio that demonstrated not only tactical superiority but also fundamental differences in military effectiveness that ultimately determined the outcome of the entire Pacific War. The Marines who held Fonte Plateau understood they had participated in something historically significant, but the full meaning of their achievement only became clear decades later, when military historians analyzed the battle within the context of Pacific theater operations. They demonstrated that American infantry possessed capabilities that enemy commanders had severely underestimated, capabilities that proved decisive in every subsequent campaign of the war. 3 months after the Battle of Fonte Plateau, Colonel Well stood in the operations center of the newly constructed airbase, which now occupied the very ground where Japanese forces had launched their last desperate assault. A massive runway stretched across the area that had been soaked with blood during 6 hours of fierce fighting. But now, B-29 Superfortress bombers taxied across the concrete surface, preparing for bombing missions against the Japanese mainland. The transformation of Guam from a contested battlefield into a strategic bomber base represented a broader shift in Pacific theater operations made possible by the Marine Corps victory. Private First Class O'Connor, now recovered from his wounds and promoted to corporal, served as a squad leader in the 4th Marine Division, preparing for the assault on Iwo Jima. His experience during the night engagement on Guam earned him recognition as one of the most tactically astute non-commissioned officers in his battalion. More importantly, this experience gave him the confidence and combat knowledge necessary to train new Marine recruits who would face similar challenges in future operations. The lessons he learned defending the hospital complex were now being passed down to young Marines who would carry these methods into the final campaigns of the Pacific War. The tactical innovations that proved decisive during the Battle of Fonte Plateau were actively integrated into Marine Corps doctrine through training programs established at bases across the Pacific. Officers and senior NCOs who participated in the battle served as instructors, sharing practical knowledge on defensive coordination, counter-infiltration methods, and the integration of artillery and armored support. The institutional memory of the Corps was enriched by combat experience that would influence military thinking for decades after the war's end. The major commanding the battalion reviewed reports of recent operations, which clearly demonstrated how widely the tactical lessons of Guam had been adopted. Marine units across the Pacific were applying defensive methods that emphasized flexibility and an aggressive response to enemy attacks, rather than passive resistance from fixed positions. The psychological transformation that occurred during the night battle was replicated in training programs that taught Marines to view encirclement not as a prelude to defeat, but as an opportunity to annihilate enemy forces that had exposed themselves to concentrated fire. Imagine a situation. You've thoroughly studied the enemy, possess numerical superiority, and have developed a seemingly flawless plan. But in just one night, that plan crumbles, and your forces suffer a crushing defeat that not only changes the course of a single battle, but forever reshapes the strategy of an entire war. How is this possible, and what if such moments when all familiar rules break down occur not only on battlefields, but also in your own life? Today we will delve into a story that broke military thought patterns and showed that true strength lies not only in numbers, but also in adaptability, training, and morale. In this narrative, we will reveal how one desperate battle on Fonte Plateau in Guam became a turning point, forcing both sides of the conflict to radically reconsider their approaches. You will learn about 3 key lessons gleaned from that night that made American forces virtually invincible and gave them a decisive advantage. The first lesson is before you, right now. Japanese military analysts, meticulously studying the catastrophic failure of their counter-offensive operation on Guam, reached conclusions that fundamentally altered their strategic planning for the remainder of the war. Intelligence reports unequivocally indicated that American infantry capabilities had evolved far beyond previous estimates, particularly in critical areas such as small unit leadership, tactical coordination, and the effective integration of supporting arms. The complete annihilation of numerically superior forces in a single engagement graphically demonstrated that traditional Japanese tactics were utterly inadequate against an enemy who had successfully combined advanced technology with exceptional training and the highest combat morale. The strategic consequences of the Battle of Fonte Plateau profoundly impacted Japanese defensive preparations on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and even the Japanese home islands themselves. Military commanders bitterly realized that frontal assaults on prepared American positions would only lead to catastrophic losses without achieving any tactical objectives. New defensive doctrines now emphasized prolonged resistance from pre-fortified positions, rather than counter-offensive operations designed to push American forces back to their landing beaches. The psychological shock of the defeat on Guam convinced Japanese planners that their troops were no longer capable of achieving decisive victories against American infantry in open combat. Stay with us and watch until the end, as this story is full of unexpected twists. We would be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, don't forget to write in the comments where you are watching us from. Marines wounded in the night battle and evacuated to hospitals in Hawaii and the continental United States inadvertently became living testaments to the evolving capabilities of American ground forces. Their accounts of the battle, shared with medical personnel, visiting dignitaries, and war correspondents, contributed to a growing understanding that the Pacific War had entered a new phase characterized by overwhelming American tactical and technological superiority. The transformation of young recruits into battle-hardened veterans in a single night of fighting vividly demonstrated the exceptional effectiveness of Marine Corps training and leadership development programs. The technological advantages that proved decisive during the Fonte Plateau engagement were now being successfully replicated and refined throughout the Pacific theater of operations. Stay with us and watch until the end, as this story is full of unexpected twists. We would be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, don't forget to write in the comments where you are watching us from. Radio communication systems, which enabled Marine units to coordinate defensive fire and mutual support, were actively modernized with more powerful transmitters and enhanced encryption capabilities. Artillery methods developed during the battle were standardized and taught to crews supporting operations from the Philippines to the Central Pacific. Tank infantry coordination procedures were meticulously refined based on lessons learned from the successful defense against Japanese infiltration attacks. These changes laid the groundwork for further successes, which we will discuss next. Colonel Well received an assignment to the Pacific Fleet Staff, where his tactical expertise was immediately applied to planning operations for the final phase of the war against Japan. His profound analysis of the Guam battle significantly influenced strategic thinking regarding amphibious assault methods and defensive operations for future objectives. The institutional knowledge he acquired during 6 hours of desperate fighting was now being applied to campaigns that would involve hundreds of thousands of American service members and determine the outcome of the entire Pacific War. Meanwhile, the reconstruction of Guam proceeded at an astonishing pace, transforming the island from a ravaged battlefield into a major military base capable of supporting strategic bombing operations against Japan. The civilian population, having endured Japanese occupation, was provided with medical aid, food, and housing. As civil administration was restored under American authority, the contrast between Japanese occupation policies and American reconstruction efforts served as a powerful demonstration of the differing values and capabilities represented by the opposing sides in the Pacific conflict. Private First Class O'Connor's Bronze Star Medal was presented at a ceremony attended by the Marines who fought alongside him during the hospital defense. But the true significance of his actions extended far beyond individual recognition. His evolution from a frightened recruit to a confident combat leader symbolized the transformation the Marine Corps was effecting in thousands of young Americans who never imagined they possessed the courage and capabilities required for sustained combat operations. The institutional culture that fostered such rapid development of combat effectiveness was meticulously studied and adopted by military organizations across all Allied nations. This was not merely a battlefield success. It was a revolution in training and management that continues to influence military doctrine to this day. The final phase of mop-up operations on Guam revealed the full extent of Japanese losses from the failed counteroffensive. Burial teams, working under the supervision of Marine engineers and Navy medical personnel, processed the remains of 3,200 enemy soldiers, ensuring a dignified burial despite the circumstances of their deaths. The respect shown for fallen enemies reflected the professional standards that distinguished American military operations and contributed to subsequent reconciliation between former adversaries in the post-war period. Intelligence gathered from captured documents and interrogated prisoners revealed the detailed planning that preceded the Japanese attack on Fonte Plateau. Enemy commanders possessed accurate information regarding American defensive positions, troop strengths, and tactical procedures. Yet they were completely unprepared for the fighting spirit and tactical adaptability that Marine units demonstrated during this decisive engagement. The failure of such a meticulously planned operation provided valuable insights into the fundamental differences between American and Japanese military cultures and their relative effectiveness in extreme combat conditions. The airfield that now occupied Fonte Plateau became a symbol of American industrial and military might, supporting bombing operations that directly contributed to Japan's ultimate surrender. B-29 crews preparing for missions over the Japanese mainland taxied past memorials marking the positions where Marines had died defending the land that was now vital to Allied victory in the Pacific. The transformation of a contested battlefield into a strategic asset demonstrated the broader trajectory of the war and the decisive nature of the tactical victory achieved in one night of desperate fighting.